this into a war with communist China. The general viewed the prospect of a wider conflict differently and saw Asia as the key battlefield.
It seems strangely difficult for some to realize that here in Asia is where the communist conspirators have elected to make their play for global conquest, and that we have joined the issue thus raised on the battlefield. We must win. There is no substitute for victory.
MacArthur claimed that his decision to turn the war around by means of a landing deep behind the enemy's rear was taken during his first visit to the battlefield on June 29th. His choice for an amphibious landing was the port of Incheon, 20 miles from Seoul. A successful assault would bypass the deadlock on the Busan perimeter, sever North Korean supply lines, and turn the war around.
The hydrography was all wrong. You had these fantastic tides of 32 feet to contend with, these exposed mudflats that amphibian tractors could not cross, and which landing craft could only cross at high tide. You had the unknown nature of the beach defenses. You had the situation where the 8th Army had essentially been defeated. Now, what were you going to do? You were going to land a new corps behind the successful North Korean army. Very bold. As I say, it was MacArthur's intuition more than logic.
Incheon was a risk the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff felt they didn't need to take. More concerned with Europe, they were unwilling to waste scarce resources fighting what they saw as the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Why did they not stop General MacArthur? And the answer is because he was Douglas MacArthur. He was Douglas MacArthur, almost a myth in the minds of the American people. I would say to you that if that had been recommended by anyone other than General Douglas MacArthur, I believe it would have been stopped.
The chairman of the Joint Chiefs made one last effort to preach caution to MacArthur.
General Bradley sent a cable to MacArthur, and it said, "In case the invasion fails at Incheon, what are your withdrawal plans?" Signed, Bradley. And MacArthur sent a 3-part message back, again in the open. And the first paragraph said, to General Bradley, said, "Don't take counsel of your fears." The second paragraph said, "We have no withdrawal plans." The third paragraph said that the invasion will not fail. Signed, MacArthur.
We spent the whole night awake in the school playground, and in the early morning heard the artillery firing prior to the landing. And there were flashes of very bright light, so that one could see insects crawling about in front of the school. They continued to bomb heavily, and everywhere was a sea of flames. When one looked over Incheon city, the whole city was glowing red, like a sea of flames. It was like this the whole night. When I woke up in the morning, I heard people say that the United Nations Army was coming.
It's D-Day. Target Incheon, harbor for Seoul, the communication hub of Korea. Navy guns and rockets set up a fiery umbrella for the assault forces.
Fearful of mines, the 269-ship invasion fleet was preceded by minesweepers whose Japanese crews were familiar with Incheon's treacherous waters. As the landing craft disappeared into the dusk and smoke, confused reports of the fighting reached the bridge of the command ship Mount McKinley. For a moment, MacArthur's nerve was shaken. In fact, Incheon had been abandoned by the North Koreans and the landings were virtually unopposed.
I participated in the Incheon landing. Then it was the greatest amazement of my whole life. And then since then I've seen nothing equivalent to that. In strength, speed, extraordinary organization, you had the feeling that they understood why the Americans could win a war and why they would win that war.
The North Koreans were aware that the United Nations Command was planning a landing, but they were unable to disengage their overstretched forces from the bitter fighting around Pusan. The Marines appreciated the lack of opposition to what they felt was an ill-prepared venture.
If the beach had been held with the tenacity of Tarawa or Iwo Jima, even MacArthur's strategic intuition would not have saved us.
By the second day, it was clear that the operation was a complete success militarily. Followed by the world's press, MacArthur set off to tour the front.
MacArthur arrived with this entourage. Virtually every admiral and general and task force was present. A phalanx of reporters and photographers, a convoy of jeeps. MacArthur stepped out wearing his crushed hat, his sunglasses, and his jacket. He gave the impression of being at least 6 feet tall. He always gave that impression. Actually, he was about 5'9", but he still was the dominant figure. There had been a tank infantry fight out in front of them on the road there. And in fact, MacArthur was very impressed by the fact that the Marines had knocked out this string of T-34 tanks. He couldn't really see anything from where they were looking, but it made for good photography.
The port of Incheon, through which reinforcements and supplies were now flowing, had been devastated by the assault. Its inhabitants suffered most.
Incheon, what I remember of it was just a sea of rubble. I can't remember one stable building. It was just rubble everywhere. And how so many of the people survived, I will never know. I took lots of pictures. Now, don't forget, all these civilians are being liberated by the South Koreans. I think the South Korean soldiers were mad because they shot at anything that moved. And there's all these kids, old ladies, and that, walking along with their hands up because they were terrified of these South Korean soldiers. And I just can't describe how terrifying it was. Even I was a bit scared of them.
As the Marines set off inland towards Seoul, the United Nations Command awaited the outcome of the landings on the deadlock further south. Incheon's strategic success became evident as the North Koreans wilted around the Pusan perimeter.
I mean, it was just amazing. We'd go through these fights all night and shellings all day long. And when we woke up one morning, everything was gone. There was no firing. There was no troops in front of us. There was nothing. It was like a miracle happened. It just the most unbelievable thing I've ever encountered in my life. You know, one day you're fighting for your life, and the next day you could walk out of the hole and walk all around and nothing would happen. Just an extraordinary event.
The 8th Army quickly turned to the attack, but did not appreciate that the North Koreans could simply melt away.
In our particular case, we went across the Naktong paddling, and then the other units went up some of the roads. And we had about the same effect on the scattered North Korean forces that they'd had on us. They essentially were confronted with something they couldn't handle and pretty well came apart. They were no longer an effective fighting unit 5 days after we started the breakout.
With 10th Corps ashore at Incheon and the 8th Army across the Naktong River, UN forces tried to close the trap.
By then, it was very evident the war was over. we began to take